X. Wheel of Fortune.
EN Q EN S T R I A.
Luster repeated each letter of the word as slowly as she could. Yasha paused, before repeating it back to her, his pronunciation shaky but clear.
A. Quest. Ria. Request. Ria. Questria.
A smile crossed his face.
Big word. Not easy. Luster good teacher.
Luster chuckled, but she was secretly flattered.
Thanks. I've never taught Ponish before. Or any language, actually.
In fact, she'd always been a poor learner of other languages. Fortunately, Eula wasn't a forgiving teacher, and she'd made quick progress in her Yaconian. The past month had been hell. Eula hadn't exaggerated Yakyakistan's climate by any measure. The trio had stuck to traveling during the day, taking advantage of the sun's warmth. Although Eula and Yasha could travel by night, it would have been suicide for Luster to try the same, no matter how tightly she wrapped her fur coat around herself. Her shaved mane had started to fade back in, making her look all the rougher and less civilized, but for the most part she remained unchanged. Her fear of being followed had disappeared a few days into their journey, as both they and any trail they might have left was swallowed up in the perpetual snowfall. Eula and Yasha's spirits hadn't ever been higher. Back in their home country, both of their moods had improved markedly. They even seemed to relish the biting cold and constant snowfall, as well as sleeping rough in a yurt every night. Luster, on the other hand, had been counting every inch of their journey to Luna's Bay. The small strip of land was the only coastline Yakikistan owned, but yaks weren't known as seafaring creatures. The network of ports that dotted the bay should, hopefully, be fairly inactive. The first few nights, the three of them had passed the time by listening to Luster's story. Unlike Eula, Yasha hadn't been so immediately trusting, especially when he discovered Luster was trying to track down Cozy Glow. He had only been a small calf during the Grogers Legion's rise to power, but, like many, he still remembered the events of those days clear in his mind. Comparatively, he seemed unfazed by the revelation that Luster had killed Princess Twilight.
Yasha yak. Twilight. Luna. Celestia. Yasha no care what pony Princess Both.
In exchange, Eula had recounted various tales of her and Yasha's past. The two of them came from a lesser tribe of nomadic yaks, which had sworn loyalty to the king in exchange for their freedom. Disillusioned by tribal life, the two of them had parted from their homeland and left for Equestria, seeking opportunity, only to find themselves trapped in Halcyon, never earning enough to set off on the road or return home. Some days, it seemed like the snow and mountains would never end, until, one day, they did. It had been so long since Luster had seen an ocean, she'd almost forgotten how truly immense and vast they were. One moment, they were battling their way through sleet and hail. Then, with a simple turn around a corner, they found themselves struck by the vision of a vast, glittering, sapphire-blue plain. She could still see it now, framing the rising sun that jumped at her whenever the wind blew the yurt's entrance open.
Okay. I think we've done enough for today.
Luster levitated her quills and parchment back into her saddlebags.
I'm impressed, as always. Are you sure Eula hasn't been giving you lessons behind my back?
Yasha grinned.
No. Yasha no want learn talk like yak. Want learn talk like pony.
Luster raised an eyebrow.
Yasha mean. I mean.
He scratched his head, as if the concept of a personal pronoun was somehow beyond his grasp.
I want to learn, too. Talk like, pony.
Luster snorted.
Amazing. We'll make a Canterlot socialite of you yet. Come on, let's get some breakfast. Welcome, Your Highness. My deepest condolences for your loss. All of Equestria joins you in mourning for your sister-in-law.
Moonlight bowed as deeply as she could before Princess Cadence and Prince Shining Armor, eyes fixed on the ground out of respect. Both Cadence and Shining Armor looked as if they had cried their tears for twilight long ago, but the Prince Consort's lower jaw trembled slightly nonetheless. He had foregone his usual armor in place of a single black band tied loosely around his neck, matching with his wife. Cadence still wore her crown, though her trademark golden adornments were absent. Middle age had taken its toll on the pair, no matter how much they tried to hide it.
Thank you, Chancellor Moonlight. I understand we have you to thank for unifying Equestria in her hour of need. The world owes you a great debt.
Cadence's voice was weak, but polite. She sounded pathetic, as if she could collapse any moment. Moonlight was only just able to catch herself from agreeing with the princess. Instead, she gave her a well-rehearsed sad smile.
I live to serve my country, princess, just as you lived to serve yours. It was the least I could do.
Shining Armor looked less impressed. He blamed Moonlight for his sister's death. She could see it in his eyes. When he spoke, there was a quiet undercurrent of anger in his voice.
It's good to be back in my home country. We look forward to helping out in any way we can.
He tilted his head to one side, and a thin, pale white crystal pony with slicked back hair and dressed in a formal uniform stepped forward. He looked almost bored, and when he spoke, his voice dripped with self-assurance.
Miss Moonlight, my name is Ivory Brilliant, the ambassador to Equestria for the Crystal Empire, but I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting. Though, strangely enough, I was able to speak with Admiral Gallus, your vice-chancellor. I suppose you were occupied with more important matters.
Moonlight's hackles raised.
Chancellor. It's Chancellor, Moonlight, Ambassador. And you're right, I have many pressing issues on my hoop. I'm afraid, sometimes, I rely on less senior members of my cabinet to deal with minor issues.
Pleased to see his smile slip from his face, she extended a hoof, which he didn't take.
How may I help you? I understand. Well, as I'm sure you're aware, the Crystal Empire and Equestria share a unified royal lineage, of which ours is alive and well. With the passing of Princess Twilight, the Crystal Empire stands ready and waiting to offer whatever assistance it can to the rest of ponykind. I'm pleased to hear that, Ambassador.
Moonlight knew exactly what he meant by that, and didn't intend to hide it.
But I'm afraid Equestria is already safe in the hooves of its ruling council. Princess Cadence's considerable abilities are no doubt already stretched as it is, managing your kingdom. I wouldn't want to demand any more of her.
Ivory smiled graciously.
Oh, I wasn't thinking about our ruling princess. With all due respect, a powerful and illustrious nation such as Equestria needs a younger leader. Somebody who can re-energize the nation and capture the love of its citizens. Wouldn't you agree?
He stepped to the side.
I would like to present Her Royal Highness, Flurry Heart.
Despite her long service in the Royal Guard, Moonlight had only seen the Crystal Empire's heir a few times in her life, the last almost 7 years ago. But the alicorn that stepped forward now could barely register as the same awkward teenager she'd once known. Possessing a commanding sense of authority Moonlight hadn't thought possible from a mare of her age. Unlike her parents, she wore the full ceremonial shoes and necklace of the Crown Princess, and when she spoke, her voice could cut glass.
Chancellor Moonlight, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope you're doing well.
Moonlight jerked her head upwards slightly, in acknowledgement.
Likewise, Princess.
She turned her attention back to the ambassador.
To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit? Princess Flurry Heart is visiting Equestria to conduct a public relations campaign to raise the equestrian spirit, but, beyond that, to prepare her for assuming control over Equestria, and in time, the Crystal Empire. Our two nations will finally be unified once more.
He smiled, showing rows upon rows of pearly white teeth.
Rejoice, Chancellor! Your search for a successor is at an end.
Moonlight glanced back at the mare. How old was she again? 25? In front of her, did they think she was completely stupid?
Ambassador, I am. I'm afraid I cannot allow this to happen. Princess Flurry Heart is far too young and inexperienced to rule a nation like Equestria. I'm sorry, but I beg to differ.
Flurry Heart's steel voice cut across her, and Moonlight found her voice dying in her throat.
Dispensing with modesty, I've been prepared for the throne all my life, and I've aided my mother in her duties since I was 16. I can think of no pony more qualified than me to assume control of Equestria.
There was no arrogance in her voice. It wasn't a brag. It was a statement of fact.
In any case, I don't intend to ask you to take it on faith.
Flurry Heart continued, her tranquil blue gaze overpowering Moonlight's protestations.
As my ambassador said, during this visit I'll have plenty of opportunities to engage with the equestrian public. After the funeral, I intend to remain here and join your ruling council until I am ready to be coronated.
She smiled.
Equestria needs an alicorn to govern. Your own council recognized this fact. Is this not a perfect marriage of circumstances? Princess Twilight was less than 10 years older when she assumed control under far less clement circumstances.
Ivory sounded pleased with himself.
I have to say, Chancellor, I had expected you to be happier at this development. Surely you haven't become accustomed to power in these few weeks?
Moonlight glared at him.
Such accusations demean you, Ambassador. This is a time of national mourning, and I refuse to be drawn into such a petty dispute.
Inwardly, she cursed herself for allowing herself to be caught off guard. Her hoofs were more or less tied. As an alicorn blood relation of Princess Twilight, Flurry Heart had a perfectly legitimate claim to the throne. Still, did they really expect her to be able to govern a kingdom like Equestria all by herself? Or did they?
Enough of this.
Cadance stepped forward and laid a hoof on Flurry Heart's back.
I'm here to pay my respects to my sister-in-law. I'm sure this affair can wait a few days.
She glanced at Moonlight, and immediately the Chancellor could see the terrible sadness behind her eyes.
Can you take us to her?
The royal mausoleum was a cold and eerie place then. The body of Twilight laid in state alongside the tomb of the royal sisters. An enormous statue of two intertwined skeletal alicorns that loomed over the party as they surrounded the motionless body of the deceased princess. Cadance pulled shining armor into a close embrace as they approached, both apparently unsteady on their hooves. The ambassador attempted to look disinterested, but could not hide his discomfort at the sight of the princess's lifeless body. Only Flurry Heart appeared genuinely unaffected by the scene, taking in the sight of her dead aunt without a flicker of shock or hurt in her eyes.
The body has been enchanted to preserve it for the ceremony. The princess's widow requested an open coffin burial.
Moonlight allowed a moment to pass.
We will bring the guilty party to justice, your highnesses. I promise you.
Through a thick throat and wet eyes, Cadance sighed with exasperation.
Justice won't bring my sister-in-law back. But, thank you. I only wish that.
Her voice caught in her throat.
That is, had not come to this.
Moonlight gave a deep bow.
Ambassador, I think we should give the royal family a moment of privacy. Oh, of course.
The sound of his name dragged Ivory out of his stupor.
Once again, my deepest condolences, Your Majesty.
The two ponies swept from the room. They had barely cleared the exit before they began to snap at each other.
You must be deluded. So, my suspicions were correct. You have no intention of restoring any pony to the throne, Flurry Heart or otherwise. And what if I didn't?
Moonlight bit right back.
The Western and Eastern fleets, even the Wonderbolts, all recognized the Equestrian Grand Council as the legitimate governing authority of their country. Where was the Crystal Empire when Twilight was murdered? Where were you 3 weeks ago, when riots consumed Manhattan and had to be pacified? Where were you a week ago, when Griffin bandits raiding throughout the Badlands had to exterminate it? Where were you 2 days ago, when discord threatened us in the heart of Canterlot, and we drove him off?
She didn't wait for an answer.
Nowhere. Hiding in your castle, waiting for the perfect moment to strike and claim Equestria for your own. Well, you're too late. Equestria will forge its own future, without the Crystal Empire or Flurry Heart, who will be returning to the Crystal Empire with her parents as soon as this funeral is over.
Ivory's smile never wavered.
Bold words, but empty. Florrie Hart is scheduled to break the news in a few days, just after the funeral. What do you intend to do? Throw her in prison, perhaps?
Something deadly flashed in his eyes.
Such a decision would be an incorrigible act of war. That won't be necessary.
Moonlight was bluffing, but she didn't think Ivory had seen through her yet.
The royal family will be returning home after the funeral. I'll have the equestrian guard escort them personally.
She came to a halt outside Canterlot Castle's throne room.
You, on the other hand, will be leaving tonight. If you wish to preserve a shred of your dignity, you'll be gone by sunset. If not, I can have you extradited.
She wrenched the throne room door open with an extended wing.
Good evening, Ambassador.
The glowering ivory stare as the door slammed in his face could have melted lead. With every dreary, monotonous step, the ocean seemed to get no closer. Luster knew, logically, that they too must be getting closer, but she could have sworn on Celestia the bay hadn't moved in the last 2 hours. She was so preoccupied with her aching hooves and pessimism. She didn't notice Eula sticking a hoof out in front of her until she tripped right over it and went face-planting into the snow.
Sorry,
Eula muttered under her breath, pulling Luster to her hooves and shaking her vigorously to remove the snow stuck to her head.
Look ahead. Ponies.
Luster felt the cold expelled from her body in seconds as her heart began to pound. Peering ahead, she could just about make out a few colorful flashes through the snow. As her vision adjusted, the outline of stallions became unmistakable. But what were they doing out here?
Could we go around another way?
Eula shrugged.
Maybe. Not know this part of the mountain too well. Risky. Might get lost.
Luster had expected the answer. She couldn't afford to alert Equestria to her whereabouts. If that meant getting rid of a small patrol of guards, so be it. Assuming they were guards. Creeping as close as she dared, her horn flashed 3 times, and the stallions crumpled to the ground, unconscious. As she approached, she was relieved to see that they were indeed guards, but unlike any she'd ever seen. Each was dressed in a thick orange thermal jacket with matching cloth face masks. But despite the masks, she recognized all 3 of them. They were all royal guards. But what were royal guards doing this far from Canterlot?
Something wrong?
Eula inquired. Luster swallowed, then shook her head.
I recognize them. I think these stallions were sent here from Canterlot to intercept us.
How had they figured out where she was going? From the incident at Halcyon? Or was Equestria simply scattering royal guards across the world, in vain hopes they would happen upon Luster by chance? They were still in Yakiyakistan, for Celestia's sake. Were they really willing to risk war, just for her?
We should keep moving. I want to be in the Griffin Empire as soon as possible.
Eula nodded gruffly.
What do with them?
Luster glanced down at the unconscious stallions. They would wake up in 10 minutes. But the cold might get there first. Her horn glowed once more, and a small flame leapt into the air, tearing a few branches from a nearby dead tree. Luster set the burning bundle down in between the motionless guard.
Let's go.
The sun slowly set and the moon rose, but Luster insisted on walking through the night, desperate to put as much distance between them and the guards as possible. With renewed vigor in her step, the trio arrived at Luna's Bay just as the sun had begun to rise once more. The port town of Capstone was the definition of a ghost town. A few bored-looking yaks drifted around, barely even looking up to acknowledge the visitors, which suited Luster just fine. All she wanted was to find a ship traveling to the Griffin Empire and be on her way. It took her less than an hour to size up such a suitable vessel. A Griffin fishing trawler was stopping in Capstone to pick up some supplies before returning to port in the Griffin Empire. Though they had turned their nose up at Eula and Yasha, the captain, a keen-eyed, grizzled old hen whittled with scars, took great interest in Luster when she realized she was a unicorn.
Always good to have a magician on board. Show me what you can do, Philly.
As much as Lester resented being treated like a fool, and as much as the prospect of spending the next few days trapped aboard a ship that stank of dead fish repulsed her, she complied, and promptly raised the entire ship, crew and all, out of the water, much to the captain's delight.
Now, that's what I'm talking about. All right, you're on. A few extra claws on deck seems a small price to pay for an unsinkable ship.
She extended a withered claw, then forced it into Lester's hoof.
Name's Gilda. Been running ships back and forth across this ocean for 15-odd years now. Can't say I've seen too many ponies on the route, though.
Lester gave her what she hoped was a confident smile.
Golden Sun. I'm traveling to the Griffin Empire for work. Right.
Gilda's eyes slid sideways to the pair of yaks behind Lester.
And stopped to pick up hitchhikers on the way? Ha ha. Eves, well, you see.
Lester's voice faded away as she realized the lie was going nowhere.
Forget it. It's none of my business. Shouldn't even have asked.
She leaned in slightly, her voice suddenly lowering to a cruel whisper.
But don't ever lie to me again, or you and your furry friends are going overboard. Got it?
Lester nodded, staring at her hooves in humiliation. Gilda slapped her on the back and bellowed at her crew to prepare for departure. Slinging her saddlebags over her shoulders with a sigh, Lester, Eula, and Yasha boarded the ship. Emblazoned on the right-hand side in stark white letters was the name, Rainbow's Gift. Surprisingly, she found herself suppressing a chuckle. There was nothing about this drab, gray hunk of smoke, glass and steel that even remotely suggested a rainbow. What had the builder been thinking? They were shown to their quarters by a gruff and silent griffin who treated them as little more than a nuisance. The accommodation was somewhat Spartan, being little more than a cramped room with a few bags of oats on which they could sleep. But Lester was so tired she would have happily collapsed on a bed of nails. Muttering her thanks to the griffin, she dragged 2 bags together and was asleep before she had even finished lying down. As she slept, the ship weighed anchor and set off. Hours passed, and the sun slowly slipped below the waterline as dry land slowly began to slip into the distance, before vanishing altogether from the horizon. It was a quiet night, and the sea was still enough that the vast tapestry of stars could be clearly seen as a reflection in the ink-black water. Though this stretch of ocean had once brimmed with activity, trade vessels, pirates, and fishing trawlers like this one, the frosty relationship between the ponies and the griffins had meant a slow but steady decline in commercial travel. The frequent incursion by military vessels hadn't helped either. They surged forth from the darkness so effortlessly, they might as well have been sailing on air. Gilda couldn't remember the last time she'd ever seen single ship as large cut through the water so swiftly, let alone dozens. The seal of Equestria, emblazoned on their hulls, shone like a beacon in the light of the full moon. The Western Fleet was truly a sight to behold. The Rainbow's Gift was brought to a swift halt. Gilda had no doubt that if she attempted to cut across their path, they would be smashed to pieces against one of their hulls. They probably wouldn't even notice it. As the crew watched in astonishment, the silent Leviathan steamed past. A few spotlights were shown on them, but none showed any real interest. From the bridge of S. Harmony, Admiral Gallus received a short report, before scoffing and tossing it into a wastebasket. The crew must be getting paranoid. Just another griffin vessel reeling in fish. The worst thing they could have stashed aboard would be some fish illegally caught in equestrian water, certainly far below the notice of the Grand Western Fleet. Moonlight was pleased to discover that Ivory had indeed fled by the time she rose, scampering back to the Crystal Empire with his tail between his hooves. Of course, he had undoubtedly already begun plotting his revenge, even as he licked his wounds. But she no longer cared. Routine summoned her. Bills needed to be approved and signed. There were events to attend to and officiate, photo ops, press briefings, and a million other mundane tasks that consumed her in time and mind. Maybe Twilight had enjoyed this, but she found it exhausting, not to mention demeaning. She sorely missed the regimentation of military life. The fact that she was still receiving telegrams from Gallus instructing her on how exactly to behave and act was just the final twist of the knife. As she finally sat down to force down a small lunch in between two equally pointless and dull appointments, her blood boiled at the sound of a soft knocking on the door. Closing her eyes, she counted to 10, then replied in as calm and collected a voice as she can muster.
Is it important?
The door creaked open, and in stepped the last mare she wanted to see. Fighting to keep her temper, Moonlight forced a smile onto her face, bitterly swallowing the pain it caused her.
Flurry Heart, I'm sorry. I'm very busy at the moment. Could it wait until this evening? Relax, Chancellor.
Flurry Heart closed the door silently behind her.
I've arranged for somebody else to take your place at the opening of the Museum of Royal Heritage. We should have more than enough time together.
She raised a hoof before Moonlight could say anything.
Being a member of the royal family does come with some authority.
Inwardly, Moonlight was relieved she didn't have to attend yet another grand opening, but it sounded like Flurry Heart had plans to eat up her time anyway.
And what do we have to discuss?
She knew what the answer was going to be before the words had even left her lips. Flurry Heart cocked her head to one side, studying Moonlight intensely as if trying to read her mind.
You sent my ambassador home. I felt the need to ask why.
She shook her head, her tone suddenly brisk.
I know why, of course. You and him were at each other's throats every second you spent together yesterday. Presumably, you don't want him meddling in your affairs. We have that in common. We do?
Moonlight hadn't expected that. Flurry Heart nodded.
I make no secret of my desire to accede to the equestrian throne, of course. But Ivory is brash and confrontational. He treats this affair like a conquest. I see it differently.
She nodded in the direction of a chair.
May I? Of course. Thank you.
Taking a seat, she continued.
I've been watching the situation here closely, asking the right questions to the right ponies. I hope you won't mind if I'm frank with my assertion that you are little more than a figurehead to Admiral Gallus.
Moonlight paused, then nodded. She was too tired to argue the case.
That's one way of looking at it. I wouldn't call myself a figurehead, though. More of a public relations figure. I understand. I assume you were chosen for your close relationship with Princess Twilight. Of course. Any pony or anything even loosely associated with the monarchy was seized upon. The more we could present ourselves as the successors of Princess Twilight, the more legitimate we would seem.
There was a twisting in her stomach as the words came out of her mouth. She could almost have been arguing Flurry's case for her.
Except for the niece of the princess herself.
A smile played its way onto Flurry's lips.
I hope I'm not laying it on too heavily, but you must see this from my point of view. Gallus has done well by Equestria, but do you really intend to prop him up as dictator indefinitely?
Moonlight felt that same sense of anger stirring in her chest.
Gallus and I have seen down the forces of Tartarus to settle Equestria. After everything we've been through, you expect us to just roll over and... Chancellor, please.
Flurry Heart's tone immediately overpowered Moonlight's stuttering.
I can assure you that your gallant efforts will be rewarded with the honor and prestige they are due. Gallus, too. I know you well. You've served in the Royal Guard for coming up to 40 years. In all that time, you've never once tried to leverage your position to grasp onto power. You've been the perfect soldier, loyal and disciplined.
The corners of her mouth softened.
Is this really what you want? Playing second fiddle to this? What is this? Some kind of military dictatorship?
Moonlight should have snapped at her, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded. After all, Flurry was right.
It might interest you to know that my parents are utterly against this whole affair. They still treat me like a foal. But I'm not here to prove my name. We didn't choose to be here. Fate chose. U.S. Who are you to fight against the course of destiny?
From outside the window, the sun slowly floated behind Flurry Heart's head, illuminating her features in a soft halo.
Won't you join me and help me bring unity to this broken country? You're Country?
Moonlight swallowed the lump slowly rising in her throat. Certainly, it was a good pitch. But there was something so innocent, so pure, so utterly selfless about Flurry Heart's demeanor that made her believe, truly believe, that it wasn't a pitch. It was the truth. It had been too long since she'd heard the truth without it being painfully twisted or shredded to fit a carefully crafted agenda.
If I were to agree to this, you understand Gallus is unlikely to take it. Well,
that was an understatement.
What are we to do? The wrong move could tear this country in two.
Already, the gears in her head were turning. She'd studied military strategy her whole life, and right now she was in the zone.
We cannot lose the Western Fleet. If we do, we lose the western coast of Equestria, and set ourselves up for decades of internal conflict. The financial cost alone would cripple us, and leave us vulnerable to external forces. If the Griffins come bearing demand for tribute, we will be in no position to refuse. The hit alone to morale would. Chancellor,
Flurry Heart cut in.
I understand your concern. I share them, but there will be no need for a grand strategy this time. I believe, firmly, that Admiral Gallus will see the light and rejoin his country peacefully to be recognized as a hero. If, by some unhappy circumstance, he decides not to.
She sighed, eyes downcast.
Then I will have to arrange for the matter to be resolved more delicately. But there will be no war. I am here to bring unity, not strife. Cast such thoughts from your mind. They do not befit the captain of the Royal Guard.
Under any other circumstances, those words would have been a demotion. But to Moonlight, they were a return to normalcy.
As you wish. Princess, when do you intend to make the announcement? After my aunt's funeral. The day will be a somber and unpleasant affair. It will do the nation good for there to be some good news at the end of it. You may inform the Equestrian Guard, my apologies, the Royal Guard, in advance. My security is, I'm afraid, about to become a far more serious affair. I'll speak with my parents tonight and explain the situation to them. I hope they'll see if my way, but if they don't, then that's too bad. Equestria needs me more than they do. I'll get my lieutenants to spread the word through the ranks tonight. The majority of the force is presently on deployment, but they've had no success. In any case, there's more than enough guards under my command here to provide you with round-the-clock protection. Still searching for my aunt's killer.
Flurry Heart sighed.
Between you and me, you'll never find her. My aunt would never stop talking about how gifted her protégé was. She's probably overseas, with a new name and identity, living as anonymously as she can. Surely.
Moonlight wasn't sure how to respond.
Surely you must want vengeance. Your aunt was a wonderful mare. I miss her very much. But my mother is right, for once.
Flurry Heart sighed.
Mindless revenge does not satiate bloodlust, merely tempts further bloodshed. Were luster dawn to stand before me, I would happily pass judgment. But I will not allow revenge to define my reign. If I do, it will never be enough.
She glanced upwards, and Moonlight was surprised to see she looked hurt.
I would have thought you'd understand.
A macerator. A statue. Grinding. Tearing. Ripping. Roaring. Clouds of dust and chunks of rock flying everywhere. Vicious, angry roars of retribution. All of a sudden, she felt sick.
I do, Your Highness. Forgive me.
End of chapter.